Right, hello. So once again, thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by SDN on the implications of divestment from Nigeria's onshore oil industry. My name's Calvin Lane. I'm the Acting Executive Director at SDN. Unfortunately, our planned chair for today's event, Florence, our Programs Manager, is ill today. So you're going to have to put up with me today and facilitating today's event. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So the agenda for today is I'll just talk you a little bit through today's webinar on Zoom. We're going to be giving an overview of our research findings on divestment of the oil majors from the onshore oil and gas industry in the Niger Delta. And we've got 3 expert panelists to talk through some of the environmental policy and legal implications. And that will be followed by a Q&A. We'll have a quick summary of our discussion and we'll provide details to our report and briefing on this topic, which will be emailed to you after this event as well. Next slide, please. Just a couple of things to note in terms of the webinar today. It is being recorded. If you want to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, please, and we will aim to respond to as many of your questions as possible before the hour is up today, and we'll aim to finish as close to 12 o'clock UK time, 1 PM Nigeria time as possible. A quick bit of background on SDN for any of you who are unfamiliar. We're a non-governmental organisation. We've been working for over 15 years in the Niger Delta with communities impacted by the oil and gas industry and wider issues of weak governance in the Niger Delta. We wanted to host this event today because we've been thinking a lot about the trend of oil majors divesting from the Niger Delta. It's something that's been happening for a while, but it's certainly accelerating. And in its place, we have a lot of domestic oil companies moving in their place. This has caused alarm for a lot of people in the Niger Delta region for different reasons. For example, because some of the oil majors are leaving behind a lot of environmental pollution, which has not been adequately cleaned up. And whilst globally there's a lot of attention on climate change and the impact on communities, there needs to also be a debate about communities like those in the Niger Delta that have suffered decades of impact from the oil and gas industry, and who, as this divestment trend is taking place, there are a lot of open questions about how they will be impacted next. So we wanted to do a bit of, produce a briefing and report to try and unpack some of the potential implications of this trend on communities, such as the environmental, policy and legal implications. And that's why we're hosting this webinar today. So we'll be sharing a bit about our findings, but we've also got a panel discussion with 3 experts. And if we move on to the next slide, I think we've got our panelists here. Yeah, so my name's Calvin Lane, Acting Executive Director at SDN. I'll be handing over to Alex Sewell shortly, our Senior Research and Policy Officer, who will be talking about the findings from our briefing and research on this topic. We have Tengi Georgikoli, who is a public policy consultant with Natural Resource Governance Institute. Tengi was previously with the Nigerian Natural Resource Charter, where she worked on improving governance of the extractive sector. Tengi is going to give us the policy perspective on this divestment trend. We've then got Chima Williams, who is the Executive Director at Environmental Rights Action, Friends of the Earth Nigeria, so a real expert on the environmental issues in the Niger Delta, and he's going to particularly talk about the environmental implications of divestment. And then we've got Matt Renshaw, Associate Solicitor at Lee Day. Matt is a lawyer on Lee Day's international department. He's worked extensively on legal claims involving allegations of environmental harm caused by Shell's operations in the Niger Delta. He previously represented the Bodo community in a successful claim against SPDC, and currently represents the Igale and Bile communities who are bringing claims in the UK courts against Royal Dutch Shell and SPDC. And on that basis, you won't be surprised to hear he'll be talking about some of the potential legal implications of divestment of the oil majors from onshore oil production in the Niger Delta. Next slide, please. So Alex, over to you, please, to talk about the research findings.
Thank you, Calvin, and good morning, everybody. I'll start off by mentioning or just reiterating that because divestment is a general term, here we're specifically talking about international oil companies such as Shell, Chevron, and Total selling their oil blocks to domestic oil companies, which are those incorporated and operational in Nigeria. So when we look at the investment trends, we can see that divestments have been ongoing since the 1990s, but accelerated from the late 2000s, particularly since 2010. And since then, there's been 24 oil blocks that have changed hands. And all of these have been from an IOC to a DOC, apart from one, which was bought by a Chinese company. And over 3/4 of these were onshore, highlighting that the IOCs aim to move offshore or out of Nigeria altogether. Current ownership and operatorship is on the verge of tipping from an IOC to a DOC majority. So if we look at the graphs at the bottom, we can see that the average percentage of equity is evenly split at the moment, with IOCs just 0.5 percentage point ahead of DOCs. And if we look at the number of blocks where they're involved in operations, is very similar. IOCs have a marginal lead, just 3 more than DOCs at the moment. So this means that it's inevitable that the DOCs will overtake IOCs with current policy and market conditions, both domestic and international. And it's important to note that the internationals will remain heavily involved, especially in onshore gas, at export terminals and offshore. So they're still an important actor in the oil and gas industry in Nigeria. So if we look at some of the drivers that are causing this to happen, the mounting cost of onshore operations seems to be the primary factor. All the other factors ultimately feed into this, affecting the company's bottom line. We know that domestic costs to start and sustain production in Nigeria are among the highest in the world, and they're rising all the time. And then we have international market and policy forces which are changing the way that we value fossil fuels. So international companies are offloading their assets with the highest costs and the highest risks first. In terms of social drivers, we see that the international companies are struggling to handle their relationships with communities and sustain the spending. There's widespread hostilities and protests across the region, and these are only worsening. And the internationals themselves are starting to admit that they can't meet community expectations. In terms of security, they're being driven away by insecurity, which has persisted at a low level since the mid-90s. And there are new issues to endure. And these new ones are emerging and evolving all the time. In terms of the environment, it's becoming increasingly harder to avoid cleaning up oil spills or stop gas flares. There's a lot of domestic pressure enforcing fines to raise revenues, and also some international legal action, which we'll talk about a bit later. And then, of course, there's a lot of political and policy uncertainty, which just makes other countries more attractive investment environments when these companies are reshuffling their global portfolios. So if we move on to some of the implications, we think that the domestic companies may struggle to maintain productivity, causing a national financial crunch. Extraction of fossil fuels is really capital intensive, and these companies that are coming in don't have the same access to finance as the IOCs. This is really important when working with the national oil company, NNPC, because they often don't bring their own share of expenses. So the companies must pay for these upfront and collect expenses in arrears. And if you can't access finance, then this becomes really challenging. There's also going to be higher exposure to financial risks associated with large debts and stranded assets. This is a real worry for the domestic financial system. The domestic oil company debt represents more than 40% of total commercial loans, which is a huge burden to carry. In terms of community engagement, so far, domestic oil companies have mixed results. There are early examples that go both ways, but they're generally failing to deliver on promises in the long term after a sort of happy, jolly entry period with communities. We see many oil companies, domestic oil companies, being challenged by the communities for failing on their CSR promises and even for using some divide and rule tactics. So there are risks that they're going to replicate the divisive methods of engagement that the international companies used before them. In terms of security, it's likely that they'll face the same external threats and are therefore likely to replicate the same problematic strategies, albeit with more limited resources and capacity. We see the biggest implication for security could come about due to second order effects. So if there's less money flowing through the patronage system and the networks associated with the oil and gas industry, then it's going to disrupt the balance of power and peace. In terms of environmental implications, the performance of DOCs is currently worse, and they're inheriting an old and problematic infrastructure of pipelines and wells, which will just make their job a lot harder. So SDN's environmental performance index data suggests that for every barrel of oil produced, the domestic companies spill more oil and flare more gas. So this would obviously be worse if it was done at a larger scale. And in terms of the infrastructure, a good example is an ongoing spill at ATO's facility, OML 29. It sounds like an old wellhead has burst. This spill's been going on for weeks now, and it's really devastating the local environment. And this follows a lawsuit a few years ago, which ATO initiated against Shell after they bought the infrastructure from them over the poor condition of that infrastructure. So this could happen at a wider scale as they're buying these assets from the IOCs. In terms of governance, it seems like accountability and transparency options are going to be reduced. These IOCs are divesting just as progress to hold them accountable for historic spills is starting to gain traction internationally. This option would be lost for the domestic companies who are solely registered in Nigeria. And yeah, we're aware of the problems that the courts have had. They've not been effective in enforcing judgments in the past. These companies are also unlikely to voluntarily sign up to international transparency mechanisms, like publishing payments to government. And this information fuels media and activists' attention, which may drop off as a result. We could also, we're also going to lose the pressure that is building among the shareholders of these IOCs and amongst the investors, which is really the leverage to bring about change. So just round up with some conclusions from the report. So many of the drivers of divestment are making business unpalatable for the international companies, so arguably caused or at least exacerbated by their operations. Some of the things I've mentioned, the insecurity, the expectations of a better deal in communities, and the environmental pollution that's leading to legal action. So this really reinforces why the international companies must be central to addressing these toxic legacies before leaving. The domestic companies are starting from a difficult position with less experience and resources, which raises a number of concerns about the next phase of oil and gas production in Nigeria. There are early signs that things are going to get worse for communities, and that the domestic companies may be unable to simultaneously address the toxic legacies that they're inheriting. But they're only just starting, so we need to keep tracking their impact and support improvements in governance and regulation where we can. In terms of the Nigerian government, it's facilitating these divestments, but it has no clear measures in place to handle the mass transition to domestic companies, let alone to protect impacted communities from abandonment. There are public statements that they want to double production capacity to 4 million barrels per day, and these are at odds with their climate commitments. And just more broadly, it's at odds with a stable future economy. So they need to start thinking about strategies to mitigate a traumatic decarbonization experience for the Nigerian economy. Now, these divestments are rapidly accelerating and require closer scrutiny and oversight. This report kind of consolidates some of the emerging points. But what is really needed is a deeper dive into these specific areas. We also need to keep a close eye out for signs that some tactics will be deployed to help make fast sales and shape narratives around this. For example, the companies must not be able to buy their way out of their responsibilities in communities or with the government in contracts to force through quick sales and bonuses. So something we all need to study closer. I think I'll end there. Thank you all for listening to me. I look forward to moving on to a discussion. Back to you, Calvin.
Thank you very much, Alex, and great presentation. Really interesting to hear all those points. So we're going to hand over to our panelists now. So to each of our panelists, you've got up to 7 minutes to talk on your topic. I do have a stopwatch here, so at 6 minutes, I will let you know that you've got a 1-minute warning. I want to stick to time so that we can allow as much time as possible for further questions and discussion, please. So I believe if we hand to the next slide, I think it Tengi is going to speak first. And so Tengi, if you will, for up to 7 minutes maximum, tell us your key thoughts on the policy implications. Oh, sorry, it's Chima first. My apologies. Chima, sorry, over to you first. So if you would, up to 7 minutes, talking about some of the environmental implications of divestment from your perspective, please. Over to you, Chima. Chima, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
You're still on mute at the moment.
No,
if you are.
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Okay, if not, Tengi, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Okay, great.
Can you hear me now?
Great. Over to you, Chima, please. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Hello, Chima. Yeah, we can hear you. Please, the
Okay,
floor is yours. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. When we talk about the issue of divestment by the multinationals trying to live with the huge deluge of environmental mess created by them across their areas of operation, which largely are in the Niger Delta region, it raises a lot of concerns, okay, because we know as recent events and even previous have shown that when they divest and sell their assets to the indigenous companies or local companies, some of those companies do not have the capacity to even operate at the level of the divesting multinational entity. And because there is inheritance of a hugely messed up environment, the challenges becomes how do we now remediate or clean up the environment, which possibly is one of the reasons why the IOCs are trying to run away from their operations onshore and focusing deep offshore, where they know it is difficult for the prying eyes of both locals and other interest stakeholders to monitor their activities. So this becomes a very big challenge as we are seeing that what is going on right now with the Ito spill, which has defied their own capacity to contain. Of course, everybody is talking about it and they are giving excuses every day, but the end point is that they don't have the capacity to control it, let alone stop it. So the aftermath of it is that when the IOCs, with all their paraphernalia, with all their resources, they have sucked the environment of the Niger Delta to the best of their ability, and it is now time for them to begin to think of serious divestment. Of course, as was introduced by Kevin or Mike, the divestment processes have been on, but the size of the divestment portfolio that was mentioned in 2021, has huge implications. And this is where, for us as environmentalists, we are warning those that we want to acquire the assets of the divesting IOCs to realize the fact that when you acquire assets, you equally acquire liabilities. So you must think through it, whether it is something that you want to get yourself involved in. Otherwise, let the divesting IOCs do the needful, clean up their mess, restore the environment to the way it was before their operations that destroyed it. And when they finish that, they can now look at restituting the communities whose sources of livelihood have been damaged dangerously. Restitute them, and then they can now begin to talk about divestment when they have decommissioned all the unwanted facilities within their areas of operation. So this is one of the ways that the divestment practice or the divestment process by the IOCs will not attract the wrath of the people, because you cannot mess up the environment the way it is. Everybody knows we are talking about cleanup of Ogoni land. Ogoni land is just a metaphor, it's just a signpost for the degradation and destruction of the Niger Delta environment and ecosystems. So, and we have seen that even where they are caught others, like in the Bodok case, cleanup exercise, Shell has not completed it. It's still a job in progress. And the polluted areas as captured under the UNEP report in Ogoni land has not equally been cleaned. They are all work in progress. Let us look at from Delta, Edo, Bayelsa, rivers, other parts of rivers, Akwa Ibom, where they are mammoth, huge sizes of, impacted area. As we talk now,
in 1 minute remaining, please.
Thank you very much. In Okotuare in Bayelsa State, a huge mangrove area had been destroyed. It was destroyed earlier on, and over time, it regenerated, and another spill is ongoing right now. So how do you divest and leave the problems when you know that those that will benefit from your divestment plans in terms of purchase will not have the capacity to remedy the environment? So the warning is for those that want to invest in the divestment processes of the IOCs, buyer beware, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You buy assets, you acquire the liabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chima. And that was 7 minutes on the dot. Perfect. Thank you. So I'm Tengi. Apologies. I think it is over to you now to talk about the policy implications of this divestment trend, please. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Calvin, for the introduction. So, as Calvin stated, my perspective is sharing opinions on what the policy implications are for the divestment. As has been discussed by the previous speakers, clearly there's been a run on divestments for a while, heightened during the 2014 and 2015. And now with this global shift to avert and mitigate against the impending climate disaster in transitioning to cleaner forms of energy, as well as the recent commitments by the president at COP26 to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. That makes this conversation very important and certainly underlies the importance of making very strategic decisions to prepare Nigeria for this eventuality of divestment. It's something that we could have seen coming as this shift has continued in terms of the environmental implications, which have been very properly outlined by the last speaker from ERA. And then there are also the economic implications, as well as the social implications, which are vast. And it's important to sort of start making those key and prioritized decisions. The Natural Resource Governance Institute's Nigeria program, in fact, focuses on examining Nigeria's oil dependency and imagining a future beyond oil, which aligns with NIGER's commitment to support resource-rich countries to achieve a sustainable, inclusive development, where you have people receive lasting benefits from extractors and embarking on this energy transition that has become a focus globally in an environmentally and economically sustainable way. Understanding the implications of the divestments is certainly a key component of this conversation, and I commend SDN for championing this conversation. In terms of the pathways through, the energy transition is clearly a conversation that is had, and it has different implications for Nigeria. We've been talking about diversification, for instance, that's looking at an economic perspective and Nigeria's fiscal components around that. We're looking at diversifying Nigeria's reliance on oil to other sectors. Solid minerals has been one that has been heralded. Agriculture has been one as well. But how ready Nigeria is for that shift is something that we need to sort of start to look at on that front. But in terms of divestments, we have the recent budget being released by 2022 budget, which is relying on oil revenues for about 19% of that budget to service that budget from oil exploitation. And the challenges there certainly in terms of Nigeria's fiscal future and being able to start a transition. One of the key things we need is in terms of an energy transition plan, obviously to address those commitments that Nigeria has made in terms of its nationally determined contributions, as per Paris Agreement, also in terms of the Climate Change Act, which was just recently passed. So there's a lot of thinking around this, but in terms of divestments, Nigeria has to be very careful to ensure that there is a just transition, which is the focus in general in terms of how we shift away in this new sort of global effect and this new world that we're coming into that's fast approaching. In terms of moving away the divestments, the government has a huge responsibility in terms of making sure that environmentally, the policies that we have to remediate environmental spills, for instance, to do with the NOSDRA Act, those are addressed and those are amplified as well within the short period of time that we have. We have the Petroleum Industry Act, which also introduces a decommissioning fund, which as well before, as last speaker stated, before those IOCs start to divest, it's important to make sure that those funds are properly funded, and also making sure that those legacy spills and legacy disputes, in fact, with those in the region are also addressed. Those in the region now would have a lack of its access to justice, where you have this transition to IOCs happen. So again, we know the issues that we've had with the Nigerian judiciary. So it would be important then to make sure that those issues are resolved before divestment. It would be responsibility of the Nigerian government to put together a policy that addresses and ensures that IOCs have commitments to remediate, either committing finances to resolve those issues so they do not escape their commitments and the legacy toxic issues that are left behind. So it's very important to make sure that those are addressed. In terms of the community challenges, you also have the weakened social contract and license to operate. There have been issues in the past with GOCs being accused sometimes of even having more challenges with engagements with the communities than the IOCs. The PIA has sought to remediate that somewhat in terms of the host community development. It would be important also to make sure that is properly enforced. And policy, the oil and gas policy, which also enshrines some of these thinking, is also followed to the letter. You also have the access to financing, which is a challenge that the GOCs might potentially have. Given that you have this global shift away from fossil fuel asset investment, so you have banks also reducing their investment potential on that. You have shareholders as well, reducing their investments on that as well. So it's something that Nigeria has to think about.
Remaining, please, thank you.
Potentially negotiating a deal between the GOCs and IOCs that ensures that that is done in a fair way, but also making sure that the legacy assets are addressed beforehand. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
Fantastic, thank you. I know a lot to consider there, Tengi. So thanks for all of those points. So over to our last panelist, over to Matt now, who's going to talk us through some of the legal implications of this trend of divestment, please. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Calvin, and thank you for having me and to SDN for raising this issue. And it feels like this could be a very important and significant moment for the environmental future of the Niger Delta. As a lawyer, I'm going to focus on the potential legal consequences of the divestments. And just at the outset, I want to get a quick disclaimer in that these are my personal opinions. They're not. It's not something that Lide as a firm has looked at in any detail, and also that I'm not a contracts or acquisitions lawyer. So the details of liabilities being retained or passed on as part of these divestments is not my area of expertise. With that said, I'm going to try and cover three topics very quickly today. Firstly, the impact of divestments on claims against multinational parent companies in their own home courts, such as the UK. Secondly, the potential impact on litigation in Nigeria against multinationals and their subsidiaries. And then thirdly, just flagging a quick legal point from the Oil Pipelines Act and the potential relevance of that. In terms of litigation against multinational parent companies like Royal Dutch Shell, my outlook is relatively positive. I was given a sneak preview of SDN's excellent report on divestments and think they might have a different view on this. But my view is that a parent company of a multinational cannot escape legal liability through divestment, and certainly not for harm that the parent company was responsible for that occurred prior to any sale or divestment. And to explain that, the claim against the parent company is brought directly against the parent company for its own acts or omissions, on the basis that the parent company itself is legally responsible for causing harm. And even after a divestment, claims like that could still be pursued against the parent company in their own home courts, assuming the claim is within the limitation period and the parent company can be held legally responsible. So divesting does not seem to me to be a way for parent companies to escape liability. And just to be clear, one of the remedies that could be sought in a claim against the parent company is to seek to compel the defendant to clean up and remediate its damage or pollution. So my overall view is that claims against parent companies for harm they've caused prior to a divestment could still be brought, and that divestment does not change the position there. In terms of litigation in Nigeria against Nigerian companies, litigation could certainly be instigated against SPDC or another multinational subsidiary before a sale has gone through. And the claim that we're currently pursuing on behalf of the billet community relates to oil spills from the NCTL, which is a pipeline that Shell has since sold to ITO. And I don't know the terms of that sale, but ITO does not appear to have any interest in the ongoing billet litigation, which would suggest to me that Shell has not transferred its liabilities as part of that sale. And in that litigation, even though Shell no longer owns the relevant asset, the claimants are still seeking cleanup and remediation of the area that's been impacted and seeking to compel Shell to effect that cleanup and remediation. So there seems no doubt that claims can be instigated in Nigeria against SPDC or another company prior to a sale. And it may be that if there are pending or imminent divestments, this is something that communities and civil society groups may wish to consider, particularly where with divestments being imminent, the local dynamics may have changed, and some leaders who may previously have felt aligned with Shell no longer feel those ties of loyalty. And a claim against an operator prior to a sale or divestment would certainly seem to me legitimate, and there may even be the potential to add Royal Dutch Shell as a defendant to a claim in Nigeria, which could also be worth considering in the changing political landscape. And it also seems to me there's no reason why even after a sale, a claim could not be brought against SPDC or another Nigerian operating company for harm that it caused prior to a sale. And in terms of litigation in the Nigerian courts, there may be scope for some optimism in terms of litigation against SPDC or other similar companies because of these imminent divestments. Firstly, as I touched on previously, there may be more willingness on the part of some community leaders who've been reluctant to challenge Shell to now do so in the Nigerian courts. There's also at least a perception from individuals and communities that they don't always get a fair hearing in the Nigerian courts in oil spill claims and even allegations of corruption and that sort of thing. And again, it may be that
1 minute remaining, please, Matt.
Cheers, Calvin. If Shell is divesting, it may not retain the same hold on the courts that some consider it to have. And in a different political landscape, judges may feel more confident about making decisions that result in remedy for those who've been impacted and even ordering Shell to clean up and remediate. And similarly, a tactic Shell has used extensively in litigation in Nigeria and indeed in the UK has been to delay proceedings, to draw them out, to take numerous preliminary points. And with the divestments, it may be they're less inclined to do that. And they just want to get out and resolve things. So there may be more scope from an optimistic perspective of resolving litigation more quickly in Nigeria. Although I do recognize that there are still various barriers to justice. And I will stop there. I do have another point, but I'll leave that given time.
Thank you. And maybe we can come back to the oil pipelines during the Q&A, but thank you very much for that. And really interesting to hear your perspective on parent company and sort of subsidiary, their continued liability even following divestment. And I think that's quite a positive thing to hear. So we'll have to go and take a look at our report as well and see whether there should be any adjustment to our wording in there. I think apart from just the actual sort of in law, what can be done, I think a concern from SDN's perspective would be that as the oil majors leave the region, there may be less international attention, and so just less cases being brought as well. So we need to make sure that you know, the spotlight remains on the Niger Delta, even as we have less international involvement in the region. But we want to move on to Q&A now. So I'm just seeing if we don't have any question and answers questions in the Q&A yet, so please do type in your questions. There have been a couple about the report and briefing paper, and they will be automatically shared with you after the event. So in that case, maybe Matt, can I maybe just pass back to you to make your final point quickly, if you would, on the Oil Pipelines Act. And I do have a few questions then that I can ask myself whilst we wait for other questions to come in.
Sure, thanks, Gavin. So it's just a brisk one. It's that so the Oil Pipelines Act, Section 29 of the Oil Pipelines Act, which is the Nigerian statute regulating the operation of oil pipelines, says that licenses granted under the Act can only be sold with the approval of the minister and under terms approved by the minister. And that seems to give the minister the power, to some extent anyway, to dictate the terms of the sale of oil pipeline licenses. And that would seem to give the opportunity, for example, to make sales of licenses conditional on a proper cleanup and leaving assets in a state where they're not likely to result in further oil spills and cause environmental damage. And obviously the perception in the past has been that there's a very cozy relationship between the multinationals and the executive and the regulator. And if Shell is divesting, that could change. And there could be the opportunity for the minister to influence these sales and have a positive impact before the multinationals leave. So I just wanted to flag that for any civil society or interested people who it may be an opportunity to encourage the minister to use that power in a positive way.
That's really interesting, Matt. Is that the Minister of Petroleum Resources?
So I think it's defined as the minister for the time being charged with responsibility for matters incidental to oil fields and oil mining. So you may know that better than me if that is the Minister of Petroleum Resources, but I would assume it probably is.
Yeah, that sounds right, and I stand to be corrected by Tengi or Chima if that's wrong. But sorry, I think I just managed to accidentally mute myself there. Thank you very much, Matt. That's a really interesting point. Can I pose a question to Tengi, please, first, but also welcome comments from any of you. Tengi, how do you think that the Petroleum Industry Act and privatization of NNPC will affect divestment?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Calvin. So obviously the PIA introduces, proposes for NNPC to become privatized, and NNPC currently has a large share in the different assets, as well as the IOCs as well. And that sort of ties in with the commitments, as Alex mentioned, of the government having an ambition to increase its production and its reserves. In terms of how far NNPC can do that in terms of raising financing, because the PIA is actually a bit silent on that for a large part, and the IOCs have been relied on for delivering a lot of those interventions. It will put a lot more pressure on the NNPC, which essentially will be starting off privatized in a different sort of way, where initially it would be insulated by government revenues or government supports. Being privatized sort of puts a lot more pressure on it with these divestments to find potential extra funding. if the DOCs lag in terms of that partnership. So it puts a lot of pressure on the NNPC, and that puts Nigeria even more at risk, because it's important to get they're trying to get as much as they can from the assets while peak demand is, I guess, at a sunset for 2045, as stated by OPEC and others stating 2025 or 2027. So it puts a lot of pressure, and it might require, in terms of that implementation, doing a bit more of a revision potentially, and making sure that the future investments and assets are adequately exploited before the value drops, as it is doing with this shift to cleaner fuels.
Thanks so much, Tanguy. That's really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And just a quick warning to all panelists that when we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to give me your most important recommendation, whether it's to government, civil society, the international community, or any others, about how we can make sure that what they need to do to ensure that impacted communities are met. So keep that thought in mind for the next 10 minutes as we go through other questions, so that you have an opportunity to think about what that one recommendation is that you would make. So I want to go on to some questions from the audience. So we've got a question from Barrett and Lazabi. Now, this is, and actually, Matt, I think we may have exchanged emails on a similar topic here. It's over the liability of a facility linked to the divesting firm. So and I know we probably don't want to talk too much about the Aiteo Nembe spill, because we don't know the facts of that. But if we take an example where a domestic oil company has taken over some infrastructure relatively recently from an international oil company, and a spill occurs, is there likely to be any kind of liability associated with the firm that has divested from that infrastructure for spills which are taking place after the divest? Question perhaps to you.
Sure, yeah. So it's not what I have a clear answer on. I mean, I think, to me, it's pretty clear that if the spill occurred prior to divestment, then the parent company would potentially still be liable, even after the divestment has happened. So you would have however long the limitation period is in which to pursue that claim against the parent company, even after the divestment. In relation to if the spill occurs after divestment and the parent company can be liable, I think that would be a challenging legal claim. I don't think it would be totally impossible to seek to argue that a parent company retained responsibility for the harm, but I do think it would be challenging. So I would certainly be less optimistic about a claim like that.
Thank you, Matt. The next question I have is from Dauda Garuba.
Please, Can
sorry.
I say something about
Chima, yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. While agreeing with Matthew, to a very large extent, I think we have to understand the distinction here. When you are acquiring an asset of a divesting company, that is no longer your parent company, because there is no relationship after you have acquired and all the agreements are signed. Everything is handed over to you and it becomes yours. So, for instance, Aiteo, after having acquired from Shell, cannot be responsible for taking directive from Shell on how the company is run. So I think when you talk about parent-daughter company relationship, we have to be clear about it in this divestment process, so that people do not conclude that there is an alter ego somewhere you can hold responsible, and that will mean that the acquiring local domestic companies will be believing that For instance, there's a question on gas flare penalties that if it is handed over to them, the penalties that accumulate before divestment is the responsibility of the exiting company, and that is if the process starts before that company exits. Because once it has transferred everything, it will be difficult to now lay hold on that company because it's no longer in situ. It's already outside of the jurisdiction of the Nigerian court. So we have to make that distinction so that we are very clear about what we are talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Uma. That was a really helpful addition there. I appreciate that. So let me move on to Garuba's question, which he's just saying, is there any reason why we haven't discussed the implications for revenue, so the economic impacts of this trend? Because obviously that's a big issue for local companies to whom the divestments have gone. And maybe just quickly from a quick response from me before I perhaps hand to Alex on this one is, yeah, I mean, there are so many issues we could have discussed on this particular online event. So we weren't able to hone in on this particular issue. We do cover it somewhat in our report discussion on this topic. And I think from the number of questions that are coming in this question, it may be that, it seems like there may be demands for us to go into specific topics in greater detail in future. And we might need to think about how we can facilitate that discussion further. But Alex, would you like to say anything on this particular point at all?
Okay. Yeah, briefly. I think we kind of forecast that the revenues will definitely decline, and this will cause big problems. I mean, it shouldn't be a shock to these companies that revenue will decline. The oil price is not looking too stable, and just the global factors that are undermining hydrocarbon economics will mean that the industry will start to decline and profits will reduce. And we just, really think that the government and these companies should come up with a strategy to manage this decline better. But it doesn't seem they're doing this. So, the revenue is going to come as a big shock to them. First to the federal government, which, still relies on about half of its income, and the majority of its foreign exchange from the oil industry. So that'll have a ripple effect on its spending and its ability to fund itself. There are studies that talk about the loss that's going to come, and that they predict that the government itself could even go and become insolvent, which would be a terrible situation. But then it's going to cascade through the whole country. The states, especially in the Niger Delta, with their 13% derivation payments, will also have a big hole in their own operating budgets, which will limit their ability to spend on social programs, education, hospitals, and infrastructure, and everything. And as Tanguy outlined, there's no real policy in place to accelerate divestment. I think the big accelerate diversification, of the economy. I think the IOCs divesting themselves, reshuffling their portfolios should be a wake-up call for the federal government to do this themselves and use some of the money from signature bonuses and other sales in this divestment and in the privatization of NNPC to actually invest in non-fossil assets. It's a really big opportunity to do that. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Cool, yeah. No, go on, Tanguy, please.
Okay, so I was going to add that I mentioned earlier on, I guess just in passing, that we have the 2022 budget also reflecting reliance on for 19% of the revenues coming from oil, and that sort of indicates that the government isn't potentially taking as seriously in terms of diversifying. Its asset is still sort of operating as business as usual, which obviously, for all the reasons that Alex has mentioned, is sort of the wrong way to go. On the other hand, you see sort of these commitments on climate change, commitments on the nationally determined contributions that are all indicating that the government is thinking about this. But in terms of the real the real terms on ground, we don't see those sort of practices being put in place. There are certainly those gaps, which again, as you said, this run-on from IOCs divestments will also cause that gap. Even though you can see, okay, DOCs potentially are coming on stream, and that might be a positive, but then again, you've only had maybe transfers to ITO, CEPLAT, etc. And there's only so much that the DOCs could even take on board, and that puts even more pressure on them. And then there's also the fiscal and financial challenges within that as well. You have an NNPC that will be privatized, that will be trying to seek those fundings as well. You have the new structure for their investments to be supposed to be an incorporated joint venture. IOCs would have had access to greater funding. DOCs likely not, only from run-on Nigerian banks, and that's also limited. So there are all these challenges that the government can also look at, as well as potential tax as well that they can get from these divestments.
Thanks so much, Tengia, and thanks for reiterating this point behind that there seems to be a big contradiction at the moment between sort of Nigeria's NDCs, the Climate Change Act, and the apparent huge emphasis on sort of investing and encouraging growth of the domestic oil sector and domestic oil companies. So thanks for reiterating that point again. And we've had a huge number of questions come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose that we will go for as long as, well, for an additional 15 minutes maximum. So 12:15 UK time, 1:15 Nigeria time. If our panelists are able to stay with us, great. If you need to go to other meetings, so be it. But we'll try and answer as many questions as we can now. Any that we don't answer, Alex, if you can save any questions that come in, and we'll aim to get back to anyone individually afterwards as well, so that we can respond to as many questions as possible. We have had a lot of questions come in, which is fantastic to see the level of interest in this topic. I think there's a question here from Dr. Thomas Harry around whether, for example, outstanding penalties for gas flares would be inherited by domestic oil companies. I believe Chima pretty much responded to that one already, saying that that it shouldn't be, but the problem will be reclaiming those penalties once an IOC has divested. But I do want to sort of pick up on one technical issue with Matt here, which I think this raises is, Matt, if you take, for example, Shell and SPDC, if Shell just sold SPDC, is that a way that parent company liability could be avoided in the future, or do you not think that that's the case?
No, I don't think that would help Royal Dutch Shell to escape liability. As I said, so the claim against Royal Dutch Shell, it's not premised on its ownership of SPDC. But a claim against Royal Dutch Shell is premised on its own legal responsibility and its own acts and omissions. And obviously, as a parent company of SPDC, it has the ability to intervene and to influence people in a particular relationship with a subsidiary. But the legal claim itself is for Royal Dutch Shell's own acts and omissions. So if it were to sell SPDC tomorrow, in my view, it could still be liable for things that have happened prior to that. Essentially, that doesn't give it immunity from legal responsibility.
Thank you for that, Matt. So Chima, let me hand over to you for the first question here from Paul Ogo here, which is, what happens to the numerous environmental remediation initiatives in the affected areas, knowing the limited capacity for effective remediation by local firms, which is there any provision in the climate change bill to help in climate finance and energy transition in Nigeria? Over to you, please, Chima.
Right. Thank you, Paul, for that question. This is part of the concerns that we are raising, and I think that is the essence of this webinar by SDM, so that we can look at all the options, and then we'll be able to speak to our citizens in a way that they understand what is out there waiting for them. Of course, the divestment program, some have lauded it as something that will bring about, local content integration into the oil and gas business. But if we look at the fact that all that we have seen over the years are promises that are not kept, shifting of goalposts, both by governments, entities, and even the operators on certain issues. As I stated earlier on, let's look at all the cleanup programs that are going on. There is none that is conclusive. Even the one that the government is spearheading is not conclusive. The one that Shell is doing as a result of the border court case is not conclusive. Where will that leave us in the divestment plans? Where is the place of the environment? Where is the place of the citizens? Where is the place of citizens' livelihood sources? Okay, so that when we now begin to talk about, we've not effectively done in fact, the first step of the cleanup exercise, how will we now be sure that proper remediation to recover the environment back to its natural state so that our citizens can begin to still use it for what they were using those environments for? Okay, the mangrove that have been lost, where will it be regenerated so that people can still source livelihoods from the mangrove growth? Because in the mangrove area, there are aqua lives that are delicacies that people rely on for survival. Those are lost. So if we now leave this process and they divest and leave and hand over to domestic companies or local companies that do not, in the first instance, have the financial muscle as the divesting IOCs, then the guess as to what will happen to the remediation plans and programs is, your guess is as good as mine, what will happen to it. So I think the way out on this is for us to insist, and this is what we have always said. Of course, he who owns an asset can decide how to treat the asset that he owns, okay? But when it comes to the assets that are connected with extractive companies, in this instance, petroleum extractive companies, which has great negative impact on the environment and the people of areas of their operation, be it in the Niger Delta, be it in any part of Nigeria where they have their facilities or their, coast across, cannot be allowed to single-handedly decide they want to leave. And the irony of it now to show that they are only running away because the heat is now heavily on them. Okay, all the court cases that has happened in 2021 alone is part of the reason why Shell is divesting onshore. Why is it going offshore? Why will you be divesting? You said that there are security problems, there are tax issues, there are lack of cooperation issues and the rest of them, but you are living onshore, you are investing offshore at the same point in time. Does it not smack of deceit? And our government should not allow this deceit to happen, because if it does, the government will suffer for it and the local companies will suffer for it too. And the IOCs would have taken away their profits and gone back to wherever they are coming from. So they should be compelled to look at all the ongoing remediation cleanup exercises, the polluted areas that they polluted, before they hand over, let them bring those places back. So that if the new national or domestic companies takes over, Nigerians will hold our brothers and sisters responsible for better practices going forward, not going to drag with them where they will tell you, you have already been there, you've always been there, the environment, was I the one that messed it up? So go and hold the person that messed it up to clean it up. So this is where all of us, both civil society, government, community people, we must all work together to speak with one voice to say, multinationals, you can divest, but clean up your mess first. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. Do you mind if I come in here?
That's great. So conscious of time, yes. Very quickly, please, because I just want to try and squeeze in two more questions before we wrap up. So yeah, please.
Just to pick up on this point that Chima was making about local content, because I think it's really important. We know that for years, bills and laws have been in place to ensure local content, but they haven't been abided by. You know, locals have been locked out of working in contracts or working in companies associated with the oil and gas industry, whether it's production or cleanup and remediation. And this has led to a real skill shortage locally. And I think that the ATO example really highlights this well, the ongoing spill. As we said, it looks like a wellhead burst. And, you know, this is public knowledge at the moment that the reason the spill has been continuing is because they don't have the expertise locally to shut down the well and to lock in that production. So the oil is just spraying out of there full force. We've been waiting for them to fly somebody in from overseas who has these skills to come and lock that in. This to me is a very basic skill to have, you know, being able to shut off an oil well. You know, it is one of the core skills. So if that's not there locally, it's a fault with the historic failures to enforce local content, but it also highlights the current situation on ground, that that manpower isn't there across multiple crucial sectors. And this is really worrying in the context of the PIA, which has provisions putting the responsibility to maintain the integrity of assets on the host communities if they're going to have access to certain revenues that come out of it. So it's a really big gap there, and something needs to be done to boost that capacity locally. And I feel like the internationals have a responsibility to play a role in transferring knowledge there too.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's a really good point. So thanks for making that. Very quickly, Samka Barry asked, is the PIA, the Petroleum Industry Act, retrospective? Can an oil company contribute to the environmental remediation fund prior to the act? Well, I'll quickly try to answer that. I think that the majority will repeal certain legislation in its place. And as far as I know, there's no provision for environmental remediation fund to be paid into for sort of actions prior to the act. I don't think it will be an issue that's been discussed much in federal government, but if anyone wants to correct me on that, on the panelists, please do. And the last one that I'll just take, and I have seen that there's questions, for instance, from Essa, a really interesting question about shared responsibility, which I think we'll get back to quite long. And there are other really interesting questions from people, but let me just quickly take, okay, from Brianna here. In the event of an oil spill caused by an indigenous oil company, what are the practical remedies available? Can local community members expect to see redress through the courts? Maybe Matt, from your obviously having to take cases on internationally, do you want to give a quick response to that?
So a very quick response from me is that yes, there are practical remedies available. Local community members can seek redress through the Nigerian courts when it's a domestic oil company. So yes, they can. And as I sort of said previously, that there have been barriers to bringing these sorts of cases, but there is, in my view anyway, there's just speculation, the possibility that some of those barriers may reduce if these divestments go ahead. But Chima may have something to add on this, but a short answer is yes. Remedies could be obtained through the local courts, though it's not always straightforward doing that.
Thanks for that, Matt. And in the interest of time, if Tengi or Chima do want to say any more on that, I'll ask you to wrap that up in your final comments, please. So I'm going to go around each of the four of you asking what, again, coming back to that question of what would be your most important recommendation, whether it's to the federal government, to communities, civil society, the international community, about what they can do to make sure that during this transition in the Niger Delta are protected.
Okay. Thank you very much, Glenn. For me, it is very, very clear what we need to do. Okay. All we are interested in is in recovering our environment to the state where it would have been had the despoilation and the degradation and pollution of our environment did not occur in the first place. So this means that we all have to work together concertedly, both governments, both citizens, both community people, civil society, non-governmental organizations. You know, we all have to work together and, if possible, work with the divesting or plant divesting IOCs to see that our environment is recovered. That is number one. Clean up the mess.
Thank you very much.
Restitute the people, and then those that want to invest can invest so that they can invest with peace of mind.
Great.
Thank you.
That's perfect, Chima. Thank you very much. And Tengi, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure, thanks. So my comment would be, in terms of we're talking about the divestment and those implications, but there's a broader question of what the shift to renewables and cleaner energy sources will do for Nigeria. Like I stated, there's the Climate Change Act, which includes some elements of thinking around that and how the NDCs will be actualized. But again, there's a lot of thinking. One, we mentioned around what will happen when the IOC divest, holding them accountable in terms of the legacy assets and toxic assets. I think a policy for that, guidelines that civil society can also sort of pay attention to and hold them to account of, and those commitments from them as well would be something that would be useful. But that should be feeding into the larger energy transition plan that Nigeria needs in terms of tapping into the green economy potentially, making sure that we're accounting for those revenues that will be lost from even the state government levels, which are also 50% dependent on oil revenues, and also the government starting to see that those diversification sort of policies be properly implemented as well, because there is a future where Nigeria will have no access to those sort of funds anymore. And it's important that we start to plan now, and that the planning process is both inclusive and comprehensive to make sure that everyone involved and affected, IOCs, communities, etc., have a place to discuss what this means for Nigeria and how to mitigate those challenges, some of which we identified and itemized today.
Thank you so much, Tengi. Alex, would you like to go?
Sure, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I would say something similar to what Tengi has outlined, that the government really needs to have a transition strategy in place. Is just kind of ignoring it at the moment. I think the MD of NNPC, Mele Chiari, mentioned that they're working on something, but they need to get this in place immediately. And it needs to do things like measure the integrity of infrastructure across the region, so we know what we're dealing with. Like you buy a house, you get a survey done on the house beforehand, so you know what you're buying. This needs to be done for the assets too. It also needs to outline the responsibilities before sales, such as decommissioning and remediation, which I believe were left out of a lot of the contracts that oil companies signed when they first started exploration in Nigeria. So it's important that something comes in to reinforce those responsibilities. And as other people have said here, things like paying of spill and flare fines. These need to be included to ultimately ensure that communities are protected. The PIA is restructuring the whole of the industry, so potentially there's a chance to slot something in or create something that complements that. But yeah, really need a transition strategy.
Thank you so much, Alex. And over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Calvin. So I'd say it's a really important moment. Well done, as I said, to SDN for bringing this issue to the fore. To civil society, keep the scrutiny on the multinationals, encourage them to make commitments to clean up, keep flagging this issue. Who's going to clean up the mess that's been caused by these multinational companies? Don't let them come up with backroom deals that let them get away from these responsibilities. Keep the pressure on the regulator, the minister, and the IOCs themselves to fulfill their environmental responsibilities. And to Nigerian lawyers as well, whilst recognizing it's not straightforward, to the extent possible, before these divestments, consider starting legal actions, potentially seek to join Royal Dutch Shell or other parent companies to claims in the Nigerian courts. Again, to build this as a pressure point for companies and raise the profile of the issue, and encourage them to commit to doing the cleanup as they should. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. So sorry to everyone to have overrun slightly. I think rather than sort of round up the discussions, I'll just say thank you to everyone in the audience for attending today. Thank you especially to all of our panelists. Really appreciate your inputs. And for me personally, it's just been great to hear different people talking about this issue and hearing your perspective, and and attention that there is on this issue. I think it gives us as SDN the confidence that we know we need to push this conversation further. Thank you for all the questions that have come in. Sorry to those who we haven't been able to answer in the event today, but we'll save those and get back to you all individually as best we can. As we mentioned, our research report and briefing paper on this is going to be shared with everyone who's registered to attend. This is really our attempt to really provoke this discussion. We don't have all the answers, and we don't know exactly what direction certain dynamics are going to go in as this trend continues to unfold. But we think it's really important that it's discussed and we try and understand it as much as possible. So we want to be talking to as many people about this as possible. Do get in touch with us. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Equally, you can also drop us an email at info@stakeholderdemocracy.org as well if you want to discuss any of this further with us. So finally, again, thank you so much for attending, and for all of you that have stayed on for a little longer as well, really appreciate it. Thanks so much to all of our panelists today, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with you all shortly. Goodbye.